Now we'll take a look at mangroves. So mangroves are saltwater trees. They are the only true marine tree. They're found on coastlines. Oftentimes they actually make up little offshore islands and in estuary areas. Um, they often are found where you have fresh water from land mixing with salt water, which is called brackish water. And mangroves in the United States are found in the South, so they're found along the Gulf of Mexico, everywhere in Florida, and then up the East Coast a little bit. They tend to prefer, of course, warmer water, so you're not going to see them along the California coast, and you're not going to see them up on the East Coast. But they are found also in parts of the Pacific, Southeast Asia in particular. There's mangroves there, and in India, so they're pretty prevalent. So what's interesting about mangroves, they can actually tolerate being in salt water even though they're plants, and plants can't metabolize salt water. So the different types of mangroves have strategies for dealing with living in the saltwater environment. So we're going to look at the three types that we find here in the United States. We'll start here with the red mangrove. So the red mangrove tends to grow kind of closer to the water than other mangroves, and this is the species that you might see making up entire islands by itself. Um, they can be 20 feet high oftentimes. They're kind of shrubs. And what they do, their strategy for tolerating salt, is they actually, at the root level, have reverse osmosis going on. And so they are called salt excluders. So they exclude salt from being taken up through the roots in the first place. So the roots basically kick out the salt exclusion. They get their name red mangrove because there's a dye in their root system called tannin, and it gives the roots kind of a reddish, orangish appearance to them. So a way I like to remember when you find the leaves of mangroves, red mangrove leaves are kind of pointy, so I give them the nickname red pointy head. So that's one way of memorizing how you can tell mangrove by its leaves. So red mangroves have very pointy leaves. And I'll show you a little bit more about them here. The interesting thing about the leaves too, they're kind of leathery on top and shiny, and on the other underside they're pale, and that has to do with their ability to trap in water and keep water from evaporating out through the pores in the leaves. So the shiny top is kind of waxy, and that prevents that from happening, and that's called transpiration, when water in the leaves is evaporated out in the sunlight. And so why do plants want to keep that from happening? Well, they need to keep water in their system. If they lose too much water, they dehydrate and desiccate, they dry up. So especially plants that live in salty marine environments, because they need as much fresh water as they can get. So red mangroves, again, they exclude the salt at the root level. So the only water that travels up through the plant is fresh water. So another type of mangrove, the black mangrove, these guys tend to be a little bit more, kind of more landlubbers than the red mangroves. They grow a little bit closer to the inland. These are the more tree-looking, kind of normal tree-looking mangroves. They're not as shrubby as the red mangroves are. And what these guys do is a little different in terms of salt. They are salt excretors, meaning they do take up salt water at the roots, and the salt water is transported through the entire body of the plant. But then that salt is not absorbed by the tissues or metabolized. Basically, that salt is sweated out on the leaves. So salt excretors kick the salt out through the leaves. And you can tell because if you find the leaves of a black mangrove, the top is kind of grindy and salty. So you can feel the salt on the leaves of the mangroves. So these guys sweat kind of like we do, leaving salt on the outside of the body. They get their name because they have kind of dark colored wood, dark colored trunks. And they also have an interesting strategy. They have these little roots that stick up out of the ground. So their roots go down into the ground, and then these little things come back up. And these are called pneumatophores. Pneumatophores act kind of like a snorkel. They grow vertically up from the mud, and at the water level, basically, is how tall they can get. And basically, these little snorkels help with gas exchange. Remember, these are plants that need to take in carbon dioxide to do photosynthesis. And these basically help to boost their intake of gases. And so this gas exchange area is the pneumatophore. So it's kind of cool. The leaves of black mangroves, they taper at the base, and they're a little more rounded at the top. So they're different than the red mangroves. And again, they're salty, so you have salt crystals on the surface of the leaf. You can lick it and feel that saltiness. So a little way of memorizing this: black, black, salty back are the black mangroves. So their big adaptive strategies, they excrete salt, and then they have those pneumatophores, the snorkel for air. And the third type we see in the U.S. is the white mangrove. White mangroves are also found kind of close to shore, like the black mangroves. These guys could have pneumatophores, or they have something called prop roots, and I'll show you a picture of that too, depending on the conditions where they live. But actually, most white mangroves don't have either one. So these are an especially adaptive type of tree. These guys are also salt excretors, just like the black mangroves. So they also have salty leaves. And they tend to grow very fast, so they're very rapid growers. They also stay anchored into the soil by way of peg roots. So their roots are kind of broad and kind of peg-shaped in appearance. They almost look like little tiny tree trunks anchoring them down into the mud. What's interesting about the leaves of white mangroves, let me go back up for a second. I'll show you a bigger picture in a minute. They have kind of a notch, a little heart shape at the top of the leaf. But at the base of the leaf, they have these little interesting nodes on them. And these are called nectaria. And nectar, you think of honey, you think of something sweet. Well, white mangroves actually secrete a sweet nectar at the base of their leaves. And why on earth would they do this? Well, these mangroves have a symbiotic relationship with an ant species that protects the tree from other insect predators. So the ants keep away insect predators. In exchange, the leaf gives them this sweet little sugary goodness as a treat, as a reward at the base of the leaf. So this is a fascinating example of mutualistic symbiosis. So they have evolved to have this relationship. It's pretty awesome. So white mangroves have their strategy: salt excretion, their symbiotic relationship with ants and the little nectaries there at the base of the leaf. And they can have either prop roots or pneumatophores, depending on the environment and the water levels where they live. Now, how do mangroves reproduce? These guys have seeds that are released from flowers, just like other flowering plants. But those seeds sprout into something called a propagule, which drops into the water. And it's usually this long, kind of a almost like a green bean appearance for some species, and I'll show you the differences between them. But they have little flowers, they sprout into this long bean-like structure, and then that propagule will drift in the water for as long as a year, and then eventually it will drop into the soil and take root and grow into a new baby mangrove. So, so the red mangrove has the typical string bean look to it of the propagule. Black mangrove, it's just this little tiny seed-like thing. And then white mangroves, actually, they almost look like little pears on the end of the leaves. So they have different types of propagules depending on the species. It's really common to see red mangrove propagules washed up all over the place here in Florida. And this is what they look like hanging on the tree. So they literally look like a really large green bean. And what's interesting about the propagules is that inside they have this fatty oil that basically sustains the living embryo. So the plant is alive, the little embryo is alive as this propagule drifts around for a year. And it's kept alive by that fatty oil. And the fat not only is sustaining the embryo, but it also keeps the propagule buoyant, so it floats. And then basically when the fat runs out, the propagule will lose its buoyancy and sink and sprouts. So it's a pretty awesome little system there. So what's the significance of mangroves ecologically? Pretty huge, especially here in Florida. They protect shorelines. As you can see, here's a red mangrove, and it's trapped a lot of sediment in its roots. So you can kind of get a sense that that's what it does along the coastline too. And when big storms hit and wave energy is constantly pounding on the shoreline, these mangroves absorb a lot of that wave energy and keep the shoreline from washing away. Some parts of the coast in the Gulf of Mexico are basically just one big sandbar. So without mangroves, the land would just wash away. So mangroves play a pretty enormous role in sustaining the coastline. What's interesting is Native Americans here in Florida used to actually bundle up their belongings and tie them in the branches of the mangroves when a storm was coming. and then they'd flee, they'd evacuate, and then they'd come back and their belongings would still be there. So the mangroves are pretty amazing in their protective ability. Um, they're a huge habitat for marine life, especially down in the roots. Down below the water is usually considered like a nursery for fish and for invertebrates. So it's kind of a protected area where big predators can't get to them. They can act like a substrate, so oysters like to grow on the roots. The leaves, of course, and the material when the mangrove dies provides a lot of nutrients for the food chain. And so it's really an critically important part of ecosystems in which it belongs. So here's an artist drawing of mangroves. So you can see above the surface here, there's birds in the trees. You can see some of the prop roots sticking up here. So these are the pneumatophores. And then the drop roots down below the water, you can see sponges living on them. You can see fish and all kinds of organisms. Here's manatee. So they play a pretty massive role. And in some parts of the country, like here in Florida, there's actually laws protecting mangroves. They can't be taken down. You can't just go and bulldoze out your mangrove if you want to have waterfront property. So that's a really important thing, and that basically ensures that the mangroves are kept intact and surviving. Because what happens is people take out the mangroves and then they put in this big hard seawall, which is just a concrete wall. And seawalls are terrible at absorbing wave energy. Over time they crack and they break from it getting constantly pounded with waves. So why have that when you can have this amazing thing that does photosynthesis and is a nursery for animals also, and it is really good at absorbing wave energy without letting the sediment run away. So mangroves are really important and thankfully are being protected more and more now.